In 2014, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk published a book called The Body Keeps the Score that revolutionized how Western psychology understands trauma. After 30 years of clinical research, he demonstrated that trauma isn't just a mental problem. It's stored in the body, in muscle memory, in the nervous system, in patterns of tension and reactivity that talk therapy alone cannot reach. His solution: practices that reconnect mind and body, including yoga, meditation, and somatic experiencing. The scientific community hailed this as groundbreaking. But here's what almost nobody mentioned. Tibetan Buddhism has been teaching these exact principles for over 1,000 years. The idea that suffering is held in the body, that awareness of physical sensation is crucial for healing, that compassion for yourself is essential for transformation, that you need to befriend your experience rather than fight it. All of this is central to Tibetan practice and has been for centuries. Western psychology is now discovering what Tibetan masters have known all along. If you want to understand what ancient Tibetan wisdom teaches about healing trauma and how it perfectly aligns with cutting-edge neuroscience and psychology, subscribe right now and activate notifications. You're about to discover that the most effective trauma treatments being developed today are based on principles that Tibetan Buddhism has preserved for a millennium. This isn't ancient mysticism. This is ancient wisdom now validated by modern science. Before we explore these profound connections, I want to be completely transparent with you. This video was created with the help of artificial intelligence for narration and visual elements, but it contains 100% rigorous research, careful integration of traditional Tibetan teachings with contemporary trauma psychology, and dedicated human work. Every parallel I draw is based on documented principles from both traditions. Let's start with what Western psychology has discovered about trauma in recent decades. For most of the 20th century, trauma was understood primarily as a psychological phenomenon. You experienced something terrible, it created disturbing memories and thoughts, and therapy involved talking about those memories until they lost their emotional charge. This approach, while helpful for some, failed many trauma survivors. People would talk about their trauma for years in therapy without significant improvement. Some even got worse because repeatedly recounting the trauma re-traumatized them. Something was clearly missing in our understanding. The breakthrough came from researchers like Bessel van der Kolk, Peter Levine, and Stephen Porges, who started looking at trauma through the lens of neuroscience and the body. What they discovered was revolutionary. Trauma is not primarily a disorder of memory or cognition. It's a disorder of the nervous system and the body. When you experience overwhelming threat, your nervous system goes into survival mode: fight, flight, or freeze. These responses are mediated by the most primitive parts of your brain, the brainstem and limbic system, areas that operate below conscious awareness. In a traumatic event, especially if you can't fight or flee, the enormous energy mobilized for survival gets trapped in your body. Your muscles contract, preparing for action that never comes. Your nervous system stays in high alert mode, scanning constantly for danger. Your breathing becomes shallow. Your heart rate and blood pressure elevate. This isn't something you can think your way out of because it's not happening in the thinking part of your brain. The neocortex, where rational thought occurs, is largely offline during trauma. The survival brain has taken over. And here's the crucial insight. Even after the danger has passed, even years later, your body can remain stuck in that survival state. This is what creates the symptoms of PTSD and complex trauma: hypervigilance, the feeling that danger is always near; emotional numbness or overwhelming emotional reactivity; difficulty feeling safe in your own body; intrusive memories and flashbacks; chronic muscle tension and pain; digestive problems; sleep disturbances; immune dysfunction. These are all manifestations of a nervous system that never fully came down from the threat response. Van der Kolk's research showed that trauma survivors have measurable differences in brain function. Their amygdala, the alarm center, is hyperactive, constantly detecting threat. Their prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thought and emotional regulation, shows reduced activity. The connection between these areas is disrupted, meaning they can't use rational thought to calm the emotional alarm. Brain scans of trauma survivors during flashbacks show something striking. The language centers of the brain, particularly Broca's area, go offline. This is why trauma survivors often say they can't find words for what they experienced. It's literally beyond words because the experience is encoded in nonverbal, sensory, and somatic memory. The implications are profound. If trauma lives in the body and the nervous system, then healing must also involve the body and the nervous system. Talk therapy alone, which engages primarily the rational mind, isn't sufficient. You need approaches that work directly with the body, with sensation, with the nervous system's state. This led to the development of body-based trauma therapies. Somatic experiencing, developed by Peter Levine, helps people slowly discharge the trapped survival energy from their bodies. Sensorimotor psychotherapy integrates body awareness into therapy. Trauma-sensitive yoga teaches survivors to safely inhabit their bodies again, and mindfulness meditation, particularly body-based practices, has become a cornerstone of trauma treatment. Have you or someone you know struggled with trauma that didn't respond to traditional talk therapy? Understanding that trauma lives in the body changes everything. Share in the comments if this perspective resonates with your experience. Now here's where it gets fascinating. Everything I just described, the modern scientific understanding of trauma, has direct parallels in Tibetan Buddhist teachings that are centuries old. Let's start with the fundamental concept. Tibetan Buddhism has always taught that suffering is not just mental. It manifests in what's called the subtle body, a system of energies and sensations throughout the physical form. There are descriptions of how negative emotions and experiences create blockages in energy channels, how unprocessed experiences lodge in the body as tension and pain, how the breath is intimately connected to mental and emotional states. This isn't metaphorical. It's a sophisticated understanding of mind-body integration. The Tibetan concept of lung, which translates roughly as wind or vital energy, bears striking resemblance to what neuroscience now calls autonomic nervous system dysregulation. When lung is disturbed, which happens through trauma, stress, or overwhelming emotion, it creates anxiety, agitation, inability to settle, racing thoughts, and physical symptoms like heart palpitations and digestive issues. Does this sound familiar? It's essentially the same as being stuck in sympathetic nervous system activation, the fight or flight response. Tibetan medicine and meditation practices have elaborate methods for calming disturbed lung, for bringing the nervous system back into balance. These include specific breathing techniques, visualization practices, body-based meditations, and compassion practices. One of the most important meditation practices in Tibetan Buddhism is called mindfulness of the body. This involves systematically bringing awareness to sensations throughout your body, noticing tension, pain, temperature, tingling, any sensation without trying to change it, just observing with curiosity and acceptance. Western trauma therapy has independently developed almost identical practices. The body scan in MBSR is essentially the same. Somatic experiencing asks clients to track sensations in their body. Sensor-motor psychotherapy uses mindful awareness of bodily sensation as the primary therapeutic tool. Why? Because bringing conscious awareness to bodily sensation allows the nervous system to complete the interrupted survival responses and discharge the trapped energy. You're creating a bridge between the conscious mind and the survival brain through the medium of sensation. Tibetan teachings emphasize something crucial that trauma therapy is now discovering. You cannot force healing. You cannot use willpower to overcome trauma. Any approach that involves fighting, suppressing, or trying to control your experience will fail and likely make things worse. Instead, you must befriend your experience, meeting it with what's called maitri in Sanskrit, loving kindness toward yourself. This is exactly what trauma-informed care now teaches. Kolk writes about the importance of befriending your body and your experience. Peter Levine talks about titration, approaching traumatic material in small, manageable doses with curiosity rather than force. Trauma-sensitive yoga emphasizes choice, invitation, and befriending, never forcing or pushing through. The Tibetan practice of Tonglen, which we've discussed in previous videos, is particularly relevant for trauma. Remember, Tonglen involves breathing in your own suffering with compassion and breathing out relief. This seems counterintuitive, especially for trauma survivors who desperately want to get rid of their pain. But the mechanism is therapeutically powerful. By intentionally turning toward your pain with compassion rather than running from it, you break the cycle of avoidance that maintains trauma. You discover that you can be with difficult sensations and emotions without being destroyed by them. This builds what psychologists call distress tolerance and window of tolerance, your capacity to remain present with activation without dissociating or becoming overwhelmed. There's a Tibetan teaching that all suffering comes from resistance to what is. When you fight against your experience, you create additional suffering on top of the original pain. This is exactly what ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, teaches about the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is the struggle against pain. Trauma survivors are often struggling against their own nervous system, fighting the hypervigilance, trying to suppress the intrusive memories, being angry at themselves for not being over it. This struggle creates immense additional suffering. The path to healing, both in Tibetan Buddhism and in contemporary trauma therapy, involves radical acceptance. This doesn't mean you like what happened or that it was okay. It means you stop fighting the reality of your present experience. If this integration of ancient wisdom and modern science is fascinating you, hit the like button and help others discover these connections. Let's look at specific Tibetan practices and their applications to trauma healing. Breathing practices. Pranayama and lung exercises are central to Tibetan meditation. These aren't just relaxation techniques. They're precise methods for regulating the nervous system. Polyvagal theory, developed by Stephen Porges, explains how the vagus nerve connects the brain to the body and regulates our sense of safety or danger. The vagus nerve is activated by slow, deep breathing, particularly when the exhale is longer than the inhale. This shifts the nervous system from sympathetic fight or flight activation to parasympathetic rest and digest mode. Trauma survivors are often stuck in sympathetic activation. Simple breathing practices can begin to shift this. Tibetan 9-round breathing is a practice done at the beginning of many meditation sessions. You breathe slowly and deeply, often visualizing purifying light entering with the in-breath and obstacles leaving with the out-breath. The physiological effect is activating the parasympathetic nervous system, creating a felt sense of safety that allows deeper meditation. This is precisely what trauma therapists now teach as a resource for regulation. Before processing trauma, you need to establish a sense of safety and the ability to self-regulate. Breathing is one of the most accessible and effective tools. Visualization practices are prominent in Tibetan Buddhism. You might visualize protective deities, healing light, or the dissolution of obstacles. Western psychology initially dismissed visualization as superstition, but neuroscience now shows that the brain doesn't clearly distinguish between vivid imagination and actual experience. When you visualize healing light filling your body, areas of your brain associated with safety and positive emotion activate. When trauma survivors visualize a safe place, their nervous system actually begins to calm. EMDR therapy, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, uses visualization of safe places and resources as part of trauma processing. Internal family systems therapy uses visualization to work with different parts of the psyche. These are modern adaptations of principles Tibetan Buddhism has used for centuries. The practice of deity yoga, while it sounds esoteric, has a profound psychological function. You visualize yourself as a fully awakened deity, embodying qualities like compassion, wisdom, fearlessness, and peace. Psychologically, this is working with ideal self-image and identification. Trauma shatters your sense of self. You may identify as broken, damaged, permanently harmed. Deity practice offers an alternative identification, even if it's aspirational and symbolic. You practice embodying wholeness, strength, and compassion. Over time, this begins to reshape your self-concept. Trauma-focused therapies now use similar techniques, asking clients to connect with their adult self, their wise self, or their compassionate self, rather than staying identified with the traumatized child self. Tibetan teachings on emptiness and impermanence are directly relevant to trauma. Trauma often creates a sense of permanent damage, the belief that you'll never be okay, that you're fundamentally broken. But the teaching of impermanence says everything changes, including your current state. You are not your trauma. Your trauma is an experience you had, not your permanent identity. The teaching of emptiness says there is no fixed permanent self. Who you are is fluid, changing, not defined by past events. These philosophical teachings, when deeply internalized, are profoundly liberating for trauma survivors. They undermine the rigid identity of victim or damaged person and open the possibility of transformation. Keep watching, because now we're going to look at how these principles are being integrated into contemporary trauma treatment with documented results. Trauma-sensitive yoga has become one of the most evidence-based complementary treatments for PTSD. Developed at the Trauma Center founded by Bessel Kolk, it's now offered at VA hospitals, rape crisis centers, and trauma treatment facilities worldwide. A study published in the Journal of Traumatic Stress found that women with chronic, treatment-resistant PTSD who did trauma-sensitive yoga showed significant symptom reduction compared to a control group. What makes it effective? It teaches interoception, the ability to sense what's happening inside your body, which trauma often disrupts. It emphasizes choice and agency, asking rather than commanding. It helps participants develop a sense of safety in their bodies. All of these principles are central to Tibetan body-based meditation practices. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, which we've discussed extensively, is now widely used in trauma treatment, though it requires adaptation for trauma survivors. Standard mindfulness practices can sometimes be overwhelming for people with PTSD, because sitting still with eyes closed can trigger dissociation or flashbacks. Trauma-informed mindfulness adapts the practices, eyes open if needed, shorter sessions, emphasis on grounding and choice. The core principle remains the same as in Tibetan practice, cultivating non-judgmental awareness of present moment experience, including bodily sensations, as a path to regulation and healing. Compassion-focused therapy, developed by Paul Gilbert, is explicitly designed for people with high shame and self-criticism, which includes many trauma survivors. It teaches practices remarkably similar to Tibetan Maitri and Tonglen, developing a compassionate inner voice, practicing self-soothing, meeting your pain with kindness rather than judgment. Research shows CFT is effective for complex PTSD, particularly when trauma occurred in childhood and created internalized shame and self-hatred. One study found that trauma survivors who practiced self-compassion meditation showed significant reductions in PTSD symptoms, depression, and shame. Internal family systems therapy, developed by Richard Schwartz, posits that the mind consists of multiple parts or subpersonalities. Some are wounded, some are protective, and at the core is the self, which embodies qualities like compassion, curiosity, courage, and calm. This maps remarkably well onto Tibetan Buddhist psychology, which describes various mental factors and states, and the underlying nature of mind, which is luminous, clear, and compassionate. IFS therapy helps trauma survivors access their self and heal wounded parts by bringing self-energy, essentially compassionate awareness, to traumatized aspects of psyche. Tibetan practices of working with different mental states and ultimately recognizing the nature of mind operate on similar principles. Let me share some documented cases where these integrated approaches transformed lives. A woman named Maria had been sexually abused throughout her childhood. She developed complex PTSD, dissociative disorder, chronic pain, and severe depression. Traditional talk therapy helped her understand what happened but didn't reduce her symptoms. Her therapist introduced trauma-sensitive yoga and mindfulness meditation. Initially, Maria couldn't tolerate being in her body. Any focus on sensation triggered panic or dissociation. They started with 1 minute of noticing the sensation of her feet on the floor. Over months, she gradually expanded her capacity to be present in her body. She began to notice that sensations, even uncomfortable ones, would arise, peak, and pass. They weren't permanent. She practiced Tonglen, breathing in her own pain with compassion. At first, it felt impossible. How could she have compassion for herself when she felt so much shame? But with practice, something shifted. She began to see her younger self not as shameful, but as wounded and deserving of care. After 2 years of this integrated approach, Maria's PTSD symptoms had reduced by 70% on clinical measures. She was no longer dissociating regularly. Her chronic pain had significantly decreased. She had returned to work. She described feeling like she finally inhabited her own body for the first time in her adult life. A combat veteran named James had severe PTSD after 3 deployments. He had tried multiple therapies and medications with minimal improvement. He was suicidal. As a last resort, his VA therapist suggested a 10-day Vipassana meditation retreat, a silent, intensive practice of body-based mindfulness. James was skeptical but desperate. The retreat was extraordinarily difficult. Sitting still for hours each day, he was flooded with traumatic memories, intense body sensations, rage, grief, terror. But the instruction was simply to observe, to notice the sensations arising and passing without reacting. On the 5th day, something shifted. He noticed that even the most intense sensations and emotions had a beginning, middle, and end. They weren't permanent. He wasn't going to be destroyed by them. By the end of the retreat, his hypervigilance had noticeably decreased. He could sleep more than 4 hours for the first time in years. 6 months later, he maintained a daily meditation practice and reported that, while he still had difficult moments, he no longer felt controlled by his trauma. He had tools to work with his experience. A teenager named Sophia developed PTSD after a car accident that killed her best friend. She experienced intrusive memories, survivor's guilt, panic attacks, and couldn't ride in cars without extreme anxiety. Her therapist used EMDR combined with loving-kindness meditation. During EMDR, while processing traumatic memories, Sophia would send compassion to herself and to her friend. She practiced visualizing her friend surrounded by light and at peace, and sending herself that same light and peace. This combination of bilateral stimulation, reprocessing the trauma, and compassion practice addressing the guilt was transformative. After 12 sessions, her PTSD symptoms were below clinical threshold. She could ride in cars with manageable anxiety. She had found a way to honor her friend's memory without being destroyed by guilt. She said the compassion practice, which her therapist had learned from Tibetan Buddhism, was what allowed her to forgive herself. Where in your life could compassion for yourself be healing? What would it be like to meet your pain with kindness instead of judgment? Reflect on this and share below. The convergence of Tibetan Buddhism and contemporary trauma psychology points to universal truths about healing. Trauma is held in the body, not just the mind. Healing requires working with the nervous system and somatic experience. You cannot force or fight your way to healing. You must befriend your experience with compassion. Awareness of present moment sensation is therapeutic. Breath is a powerful tool for regulation. Visualization and imagination can reshape neural patterns. Impermanence means you are not permanently damaged. Your true nature beneath the trauma is whole and luminous. Self-compassion is essential for transformation. These aren't competing systems. They're complementary perspectives on the same reality of human suffering and healing. Western science provides precise understanding of mechanisms, neurobiology, and measurable outcomes. Tibetan Buddhism provides time-tested practices and a comprehensive framework of wisdom. Together, they offer trauma survivors the most effective tools available for healing and reclaiming their lives. If you or someone you love is dealing with trauma, please know that healing is possible. The path isn't easy or quick, but it's real. Seek trauma-informed therapy, whether that's EMDR, somatic experiencing, IFS, or another evidence-based approach. Consider complementary practices like trauma-sensitive yoga, mindfulness meditation adapted for trauma, or compassion meditation. Work with your body, not just your mind. Practice self-compassion, not self-judgment. Remember that you are not your trauma. You had traumatic experiences, but that is not your identity. Your nervous system can heal. Your sense of safety can be restored. Your capacity for joy and connection can return. For therapists and healers watching, I encourage you to explore both contemporary trauma research and traditional contemplative practices. The integration of these perspectives can only enrich your work. Understand the neuroscience so you can explain to clients what's happening in their nervous system. but also recognize that ancient wisdom traditions developed sophisticated psychologies and practices that modern science is only beginning to validate. Be humble enough to learn from both. Let me bring this together. Western psychology has made extraordinary discoveries about trauma in recent decades. Trauma is stored in the body and nervous system. Healing requires somatic approaches, not just cognitive ones. Self-compassion and befriending experience are essential. Mindfulness and body awareness are therapeutic. These insights are revolutionary in the context of Western medicine, but they are ancient wisdom in the context of Tibetan Buddhism. For over 1,000 years, Tibetan teachings have included sophisticated understanding of the mind-body connection, practices for working with suffering held in the body, emphasis on compassion toward oneself, and methods for transforming pain into wisdom. Modern neuroscience validates what Tibetan masters discovered through contemplative practice. Brain scans show that meditation changes brain structure and function in exactly the ways Tibetan texts describe experientially. Polyvagal theory explains the physiological mechanisms by which breathing practices create safety. Research on neuroplasticity confirms that you can reshape your nervous system through practice. Studies on compassion meditation show measurable reductions in PTSD symptoms. The evidence is overwhelming. These practices work because they address the actual mechanisms of trauma and healing. We stand at an extraordinary moment where cutting-edge science and ancient wisdom are meeting and confirming each other. Trauma survivors have access to more effective treatments than ever before, treatments that integrate the best of both worlds. The suffering that trauma causes is real and profound, but it is not permanent and it is not who you are. With the right support and practices, healing is possible. Your nervous system can learn safety again. Your body can become a home rather than a prison. Your heart can open to compassion for yourself and others. The path is challenging, but it is walkable, and countless people have walked it successfully. Did this exploration change how you think about trauma and healing? Do you see connections between your own experience and these teachings? Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find hope. If you want to continue exploring the profound wisdom of Tibetan Buddhism and its validation by modern science, subscribe to this channel. Every week we bring teachings that can transform your understanding and your life, always grounded in authentic tradition and supported by research. Click subscribe and turn on notifications. Share this video with therapists, trauma survivors, or anyone interested in the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern psychology. This information could be life-changing for someone who's been struggling to heal. The integration of these approaches represents the future of trauma treatment, and it's available right now. I'll close with this. Whether you come to healing through the door of Western psychology or through the door of contemplative practice, you're entering the same room. The room of compassionate awareness, of befriending your experience, of working skillfully with your body and mind, of remembering your fundamental wholeness beneath the wounds. The door you enter through doesn't matter. What matters is that you enter, that you commit to the path of healing, and that you meet yourself with the kindness you deserve. Your trauma is part of your story, but it is not the end of your story. Healing is possible, wholeness is possible, and the wisdom to guide you has been here all along, waiting for you to discover it.